Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time we joined Johnston as he swam in a pool of boredom as commander of the Department of the West. Now we move into the Atlanta campaign. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, or purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop. Every little bit helps. Thank you. Johnston now marched north of Jackson and away from Ulysses S. Grant's army, but he was still hopeful that he could connect with John C. Pemberton's army. Word got to Johnston that instead of linking up with him, Pemberton had moved south, and now Grant's army was getting in between the two Confederate forces. Grant defeated Pemberton's army at Champion Hill and at Big Black River Bridge. In Johnston's view, Pemberton's troops were more valuable to the Confederacy than the city of Vicksburg, and thus wanted Pemberton to evacuate it and bring his troops north. He wrote, "If you are invested at Vicksburg, you must ultimately surrender. Under such circumstances, instead of losing both troops and place, we must, if possible, save the troops. If it is not too late, evacuate Vicksburg and its dependencies and march to the northeast." Pemberton wrote in his official report that it meant the loss of the valuable stores and munitions of war collected for its defense, the fall of Port Hudson, the surrender of the Mississippi River, and the severance of the Confederacy. He informed Johnston, "I have decided to hold Vicksburg as long as is possible, with the firm hope that the government may yet be able to assist me. I still conceive it to be the most important point in the Confederacy." Troops from all over the South began coming to Johnston's command in an effort to end the siege of Vicksburg. In all, Johnston commanded about 23,000 men, still too small a number to engage with Grant, but Johnston's army was the one great hope for the city of Vicksburg. Davis wanted Johnston to cut his way into the city to save it, but Johnston knew that it would be a fool's errand. Grant heard the rumors and said, "If Johnston tries to cut his way in, we will let him do it, and then see that he don't get out." Johnston was back in Jackson after the Federals left the city to concentrate on Vicksburg. Johnston wired the president to send him more troops, and at one point Secretary of War James Seddon and President Jefferson Davis asked him why he didn't simply summon troops from Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee. Johnston thought that when he was sent to Mississippi, he no longer had the authority of the commander of the Department of the West. Seddon and Davis both assured him that he had the power to call as many troops in the West to him as he needed, but this posed a serious dilemma to Johnston. Taking troops from Bragg meant giving up Tennessee. He would have to choose which state to save. He wrote to Seddon that, to take from Bragg a force which would make this army fit to oppose Grant would involve yielding Tennessee. It is for the government to decide between this state and Tennessee. Lydia, Johnston's wife, was in Columbia, South Carolina during this crisis in Mississippi. She would write to her husband that she feared he would be blamed for Vicksburg's capitulation. Johnston wrote back, "Don't be uneasy on that subject. If I do my best with insufficient means, it will soon be understood that those means are insufficient, and the judgment which will be passed by the Southern press should Vicksburg fall will be reversed. Remember how this Southern country condemned me for leaving Harper's Ferry, and how afterwards extolled me for it. One who discharges his duty manfully and unselfishly will always be respected, although he may not be thought a great man, and I assure you that to be the object of popular clamor is no wish of mine. The respect of the respected I do desire. Its admiration would be pleasant too." On July 3, 1863, Johnston sent a message to Pemberton asking him to attempt an escape and that he would create a diversion on July 7th. On July 5th, Johnston marched his men out of Jackson, aimed at the forces of William T. Sherman guarding the Big Black River. On the 7th, Johnston received word that on the 4th, Pemberton had surrendered. He never got Johnston's message. With Vicksburg captured, Johnston turned back to Jackson and set up defenses, wagering that the drought would prevent Grant from moving quickly, and even if the Federal army did make it to Jackson, the Union army wouldn't be able to besiege the city for lack of water and would attack the entrenchments established by Johnston. Unfortunately for Johnston, the skies brought rain, and Grant's forces concentrated on Jackson. Instead of holding out and ending up like Vicksburg, Johnston evacuated the city on July 16th, letting the Union capture it for the second time in about 2 months. As soon as Vicksburg capitulated, blame was thrown around throughout the Confederacy. Johnston blamed Pemberton, and Pemberton and Davis both blamed Johnston. Davis was upset that Johnston didn't link up with Pemberton immediately and then blamed him for not fighting into the city once it was besieged. The Confederate chief of ordnance suggested to Davis that Vicksburg fell because of a want of supplies. Davis shot back, yes, from a want of provisions inside and a general outside who wouldn't fight. Pemberton felt that Johnston had abandoned him in the city. In late July, when Pemberton was paroled, Pemberton went to Johnston's headquarters near Morton, Mississippi, and as he approached the front porch, Johnston stood up with a smile and extended his hand, saying, "Well, Jack, old boy, I am certainly glad to see you." Pemberton didn't grab Johnston's hand. He simply saluted and then stated, "General Johnston, according to the terms of parole prescribed by General Grant, I was directed to report to you, sir." The two men stood there without saying a word, then Pemberton wheeled around and walked away. The two never met again. Also in July, Davis removed Johnston from command of the Department of the West and geographically hemmed him in by having him preside over Mississippi, southern Alabama, and parts of West Tennessee. Soon, a 15-page letter arrived to Johnston from Davis outlining that Johnston misunderstood his role in the Department of the West, that he was not taken out of that position when sent to Mississippi to help Vicksburg, as Johnston believed. Johnston could have taken this communication and acknowledged that there was a miscommunication, but he didn't. Johnston felt his honor had been besmirched. His response back and the subsequent letters from each of the men created political turmoil in the Confederacy. One of Johnston's biographers described it best when he stated, "Throughout the summer and fall, the personal feud was transformed into a political issue that threatened to tear the Confederacy apart. The dispute became a protracted guerrilla war of private letters, official reports, newspaper editorials, and backstage political intrigue that gathered momentum until it was national in scope and dominated political disputes in Richmond. Johnston would have denied that he was engaged in a political battle with the president. He would have explained that he was only defending his professional honor against an unjustified attack. Nevertheless, his willingness to accept the aid of Davis's foes made him a political player, whether he would admit it or not. The war of words sliced through the Confederacy, with its newspapers and its people quickly taking sides. Eventually, a court of inquiry was launched, and Johnston was summoned to Richmond. When he arrived, he found that the court had been indefinitely suspended. Those who got along best with Davis were men who were willing to subordinate their own views and personalities to the president, men like Judah Benjamin, Bragg, and Pemberton. Even Robert E. Lee became skilled in drafting the detailed, earnest letters that assuaged Davis's jealousy and suspicion. Johnston could not do it. He would have considered such behavior an abandonment of his professional responsibility, so he kept his own counsel, made his own decisions, and stood ready to bear the consequences. In effect, Johnston's concept of professional responsibility clashed with Davis's commitment to micromanagement. Because Johnston believed in the concentration of forces, when departments all over the Confederacy called for reinforcements, he obliged as much as he could, sending nearly half of his army from Mississippi to Braxton Bragg, bolstering it for the Battle of Chickamauga. Meanwhile, Johnston used what forces he did have for supporting Mobile, Alabama, and its defenses. From his headquarters in Mississippi, Johnston watched as the war was fought all around him, but didn't participate. Mississippi was now a backwater of the conflict. Bragg defeated William S. Rosecrans at the Battle of Chickamauga, then laid siege to the city of Chattanooga. With the help of Grant and the Army of the Potomac and the Army of the Tennessee, the Army of the Cumberland broke the siege and defeated Bragg at the battles of Lookout Mountain, Orchard Knob, and Missionary Ridge. It was a horrible defeat for Bragg, and one that he couldn't recover from. President Davis removed him from command at the end of 1863. Davis really only had two options within his group of full generals in the Confederacy: Pierre-Gustave Toutant Beauregard and Johnston. Davis hated Beauregard more than he hated Johnston, and decided to bring Johnston out of Mississippi and placed him in charge of the Army of Tennessee. On December 27th, Johnston announced to the Army that he was their new commander. The Army commander began to inspect the camps of his new army. One soldier described the scene. "Fancy, if you please, a man about 50 years old, rather small of stature, but firmly and compactly built, an open and honest countenance, and a keen but restless black eye, that seemed to read your very inmost thoughts. In his dress he was a perfect dandy. He ever wore the very finest clothes that could be obtained, carrying out in every point the dress and paraphernalia of the soldier. His hat was decorated with a star and feather, and he wore a bright new sash, big gauntlets, and silver spurs. He was the very picture of a general." The men cheered their new general, just as much because Now they wouldn't have to deal with Bragg. Johnston went about improving the daily lives of the men under his command. The army was stationed in northern Georgia at Dalton. He started by organizing the flow of supplies and food to the soldiers to keep them from having to eat rancid beef that the soldiers called blue beef. The men would also receive a twice-a-week ration of tobacco and whiskey, although somewhat temporary. He gave amnesty to those soldiers absent without leave to encourage them to come back to the ranks, and those men who stayed got long furloughs. These immediate changes in the administrative aspect of the army made the soldiers love Johnston. Johnston inherited an army that was divided over its commander, and although Johnston won over the lower ranks, he still needed to prove himself to the corps and division commanders. His two corps were commanded by William Hardee and John Bell Hood. Hardee was a mainstay of the Army of Tennessee, only leaving that army for a short while to operate in Mississippi under Johnston in the fall of 1863, missing the Battle of Chickamauga. Old Reliable, as they called him, temporarily commanded the Army of Tennessee, but did not want the job permanently. He thought, since he was the senior corps commander, that Johnston would hold counsel with him, but he was wrong. That, along with the rocky relationship in Mississippi, led neither man to fully trust the other. Johnston did confide in Hood, the Eastern Theater general who came west with James Longstreet just prior to Chickamauga. The maimed general became friends with Johnston, and it was Hood who Johnston held counsel with. Unfortunately for Johnston, Hood, as the young general was recovering in Richmond, became friends with the President and the First Lady. Hood attended church with Davis and spent hours flattering the commander-in-chief. When Hood came west to become Johnston's corps commander, Hood began sending letters back to the President, reporting on the inner workings of the army and providing him information about Johnston. At first, it appears that Hood liked Johnston and respected him, but at least one historian thinks that Hood's desire for higher command led him to criticize Johnston more and more as the months went by. One thing that confused Davis and angered Johnston was the perceived condition of the army. While Hardee commanded the army, he reported to Richmond that the men were fairly healthy and in good spirits, giving an overall good impression of the state of the Army of Tennessee. When Johnston took command, his reports were the exact opposite, telling the President that the men, weapons, and supplies were entirely insufficient to defend, much less launch an offensive as the President wanted. Davis wanted to retake portions of Tennessee, but Johnston told him that the army didn't have enough wagons or forage for the animals to pull the wagons, and said it was better just to defend against the Federals who could threaten Atlanta from Chattanooga. Johnston's overall plan was to fight defensively until the Union Army offered an opportunity to attack, and then, after handing the Union a decisive defeat, he would then invade Tennessee. The President and Johnston were once again butting heads. Johnston also wanted to free up more men to carry rifles. The jobs of teamsters and cooks took many men away from the front lines. He proposed to Davis that slaves or free African Americans be pressed into service in those jobs, freeing up white men to fire rifles. Patrick Cleburne, one of Johnston's division commanders, on January 4th, in a meeting with other officers, including Johnston, suggested that they arm slaves to fight for the Confederacy. He believed that that was the only way to solve the manpower issue. In the meeting, a few of the officers became enraged at the suggestion, most notably William H.T. Walker, who said such a suggestion was an act of treason on Cleburne's part. Johnston feared such a policy would divide the army further, and when he brought the matter to the President, Davis told Johnston to stamp out the idea, which he did. Davis wanted Johnston to go on the offensive, to take the Army of Tennessee north, through the mountains of Georgia, North Carolina, and Tennessee, and link up with James Longstreet's corps near Knoxville. From there, the combined force was to move west to Nashville and capture the city. Davis believed that such an offensive would draw the Union forces away from northern Georgia and prevent the Union Army from sending more troops to the Army of the Potomac opposing Robert E. Lee. Davis was insistent that Johnston was falsifying his statements about the preparedness of his army to keep from having to launch an offensive. So he sent 2 envoys from Richmond to inspect the Army of Tennessee. One of those men was one of Johnston's friends, William N. Pendleton. Both envoys came back to Richmond with word that the army wasn't equipped for such an offensive, or an offensive at all. The lack of draft animals to pull artillery and wagons was enough to immobilize the army. Despite the reports, Davis was adamant that it was Johnston's timidness that kept him from moving forward. Despite numerous reports from Johnston and his subordinates to the contrary, Davis still believed that Sherman was sending troops to Grant in Virginia. The president couldn't believe that the Union had enough troops to launch two massive offensives at the same time and believed the main offensive would be in Virginia. In May 1864, as most of Johnston's forces were at Dalton and Sherman's forces were around Ringgold, the Atlanta campaign began. Although minor attacks were made against Johnston's defensive position around Dalton and Rocky Face Ridge, one of Sherman's armies, the Army of Tennessee under James B. McPherson, launched a flanking maneuver to cut Johnston off from Atlanta by attacking the town of Resaca south of his position. A small force of a few thousand Confederates occupied the town, and the resistance they put up was enough to send McPherson back to Snake Creek Gap and await the rest of Sherman's forces. Johnston, scared of being cut off from Atlanta, began moving his forces to Resaca. As he did, Leonidas Polk, the warrior bishop, arrived from Mississippi with around 10,000 more men to add to Johnston's inferior numbers. At Resaca, Johnston defended the town from behind earthworks and resisted every attempt by Sherman to break through the defenses. However, a division of Federal soldiers crossed the Oostenaula River and threatened Johnston's communications to the south. It was a small force, but the reports Johnston received convinced him that he needed to pull back in order to protect his army. Even after Sherman moved his three armies against Johnston, Davis still insisted that Sherman was sending Grant more troops. Johnston, irritated at these assertions, wrote back, "We are in the presence of the whole force of the enemy assembled from Tennessee and North Alabama. I think he cannot reinforce Grant without my knowledge, nor do I think he will, as my whole line is engaged in skirmishing. Yesterday he made several assaults that were repulsed." Johnston suffered from a lack of cavalry, and the cavalry he did have didn't perform the scouting and screening operations that he needed in order to understand Sherman's movements. His cavalry was led by Joseph Wheeler. Wheeler didn't care to perform those duties. He was much more concentrated on fighting his Union counterparts than scouting. Johnston's plan suffered from a lack of information, due in large part to his cavalry commander's disinterest in performing the duties of cavalry. As Johnston pulled his army south of Resaca toward Adairsville, the general was already coming up with another plan to bring Sherman to battle. His engineers assured him that the valley in which Adairsville sat would allow the Army of Tennessee to cover the width of the valley and force Sherman to attack an entrenched position. When Johnston arrived to survey the location, he deemed it too vulnerable and decided to pull back further to a more advantageous location. It was during the study of a map that Johnston came up with a brilliant plan to land a decisive blow against Sherman and maybe send him out of Georgia and back into Tennessee. The road split from Adairsville, with one going to Kingston and the other going to Cassville. Johnston believed that Sherman would divide his forces to cover more ground quickly, and that his separation posed the greatest opportunity to land a decisive blow. Hardee's corps had been the rear guard of the army from Resaca, so if Hardee withdrew south to Kingston, Sherman would send the bulk of his force south, while sending smaller units to the southeast along a road to Cassville. Meanwhile, Polk and Hood's corps would move via that southeast road. When Sherman split his force, that smaller detachment would run into two of Johnston's corps across the road from Cassville. While Polk held the Union troops in place, Hood would strike at their left flank. Johnston was excited about the plan. The opportunity had arisen. He told his plan to his corps commanders, who fully endorsed the plan. But before the meeting broke up, Polk, the Episcopal bishop, stepped forward and handed Johnston a note. It was from Lydia to Polk, telling him that she wanted Johnston to be baptized, and not just baptized by the bishop himself. Johnston, the dutiful husband he was, agreed, and in a solemn ceremony, Johnston knelt to be baptized and received the sacrament from the warrior bishop. After that, the men left headquarters and began to execute their plan. Johnston was so confident in the plan that he wrote an official message to the army saying, "Soldiers of the Army of Tennessee, you have displayed the highest quality of the soldier, firmness in combat, patience under toil. By your courage and skill you have repulsed every assault of the enemy. You will now turn and march to meet his advancing columns. Fully confiding in the conduct of the officers, the courage of the soldiers, I'll lead you to battle." Sherman indeed split his forces just like Johnston believed he would. The column of blue troops taking the Cassville Road was the 23rd Corps under John M. Schofield and the 20th Corps under Joseph Hooker. The Union column engaged with Polk's troops on the road. They deployed into battle line, but Hood didn't make his attack. Johnston sent an aide to see what was the problem. Hood explained that a column of Federals of unknown size was on his right flank, and if he pushed forward, they would be in his rear. So Hood had pulled back. The opportunity had been missed. In his old age, Johnston still believed Hood had false reports of a Union column of troops on his flank. Johnston was so invested in the plan that he couldn't fathom a thought that it wasn't going to work. There indeed were troops on the flank, definitely cavalry and some infantry. In the situation, Hood couldn't tell how many, and didn't want to risk his corps or the entire army in launching the attack. Johnston then pulled south of the Etowah River and took up a position at Allatoona, awaiting the Federal army to advance again, but this time Sherman didn't want to confront Johnston head-on. He planned to swing his army to the west and outflank the Army of Tennessee and force Johnston to move closer to Atlanta. Johnston wrote to Lydia during these retreats, "There never was a time when the comfort of your love was more necessary to me, for I have never been so little satisfied with myself. I have seen so much beautiful country given up to the enemy as to be made unhappy by it. You cannot imagine how disheartening it is, and at the same time humiliating, to see the apprehension of the people of a country abandoned to the enemy. I had rather have the agony of defeat as far as my own feelings are concerned." Instead of falling back, this time Johnston moved his army to block Sherman's advance, and the two armies would clash at the battles of New Hope Church, Pickett's Mill, and Dallas. Johnston and his subordinates successfully held off Sherman's attacks against those three locations at the end of May. Johnston coordinated the movement of troops and made sure that each sector had the necessary units to throw back the numerous attacks. At the Battle of Dallas, Johnston ordered his own attack. Part of Hardee's corps would attack the numerically superior Army of the Tennessee and gain no ground. The attack ground to a halt, and both sides took stock of their respective armies. Sherman didn't stay idle. He planned to move east again to threaten the Western and Atlantic Railroad and Johnston's link with Atlanta. Johnston's chief of staff, William McCall, came out of a meeting with Johnston and wrote home about the plan for the entire campaign. He wrote, "We have to keep close up to the enemy, watch carefully every moment, and then try and take advantage of every mistake Sherman makes. By doing so, we have thus far succeeded in making him pay 3 or 4 for one of ours out of a state of service by death or wounds. If we can keep this up, we win."